we can't blame the Russians for its existence, but they've, like I said, they find natural cleavages in the American political system, and they try to hammer wedges into them. So Black Lives Matters, Blue Lives Matters, they tried to get them going to the same events. They had a lot more success with the Blue Lives Matters folks than the Black Lives Matters folks, but they were still there. Other factions within American politics were not as susceptible. They've tried it with the Hispanics. They've tried it with the gays. Neither of those worked. They tried to get into the abortion issue, but it was pretty clear they misread the nature of that issue in the United States. But anything that involves, say, nuclear power is something they're very active in. Anything with the green community, they're very active. And they don't necessarily try to get us to espouse positions we didn't for. They try to make us more extreme, we might already believe. So basically, think of them as Facebook. The question now is whether or not they've reached their peak. One of the things we saw at the beginning of the Ukraine war is that the Biden administration unofficially went out and smashed a lot of Russia's cyber capabilities and even hit the bot farm, is what it looks like. And that is reduced the Russians' ability to do this sort of stuff. If it wasn't for Elon Musk and Twitter, we'd probably see significantly less traffic. But oh my God, the Russian trolls and everything had got a huge lifeline from Elon Musk, and that's allowed them to persist in a way that they probably couldn't have otherwise. Whoever is going to deal with this has to deal with this caution, and there's only really three things that can be done. Number one, because it's a foreign power doing it, the executive branch does have tools for dealing with it, as Biden has, at least unofficially, taken some action. The one that really matters, of course, is Congress. But for Congress to act in a meaningful way, the mainstream of both sides of the aisle have to agree that this is something that is not protected speech and pass a law on it. And since one side of the aisle is benefiting from the lies, that makes it a little bit more complicated. Remember, this is not the 1980s when we had moderate Republicans and moderate Democrats. We have a more European-style horseshoe political system right now with a lot more people on the far left and the far right. And on the populist right, I don't think they're the majority of the Republicans, but they're certainly at least 15 to 20% of the seats in Congress. Convincing those people that they've all been had over and over and over is a tall order, especially when you consider that the Squad and the Sanders crowd on the other side have also been had. Right. That gives a significant voting. And then the third chunk is kind of what we're relying on right now, and that's the courts. If you think back to yellow journalism in the 1890s, which actually got us into a war, it was the courts that ultimately came up with a lot of the rulings on where free speech turns into fraud. And we're kind of relying on the courts, both in the civil case and in the criminal case, to do that for us right now. And that's exactly what tripped up Tucker Carlson. He deliberately created falsehoods or repeated falsehoods, and people were able to go to court and say, look, this is false. We know from internal text that you knew it was false. That is illegal under the current legal structure, and it cost $800 million in the first round, and the second and the third round are still happening with other clients. And so it took that sort of action for that to get resolved. It's still playing out because Tucker's still there. He just started his new Twitter show, which is basically lies.com. He gets sued again. With Fox, it helps that he was a bit of an asshat to all of his workers, so even his own legal counsel was turning on him. But now that he's independent, he's going to find out exactly what the legal structures are in this. It's a very Alex Jones situation that is being set up. Whether or not he's learned his lesson, I doubt it, because this is not the first time that Tucker Carlson has been dismissed from a major network for fabrications. I think this is the fifth time. So honestly, it shouldn't be a surprise. The fact that people still watch him, that's kind of shocking to me. But pieces of the system are resisting this. It's just the piece that we're relying upon, the courts, it's not the fastest way to do it. Now, the United States is in the midst of a labor shortage, which is one of the reasons that I think a more open immigration system would be good. I'm also not blind about this, and it has to happen in the legal way. We haven't had meaningful reform of the immigration system since 1987. It's time for Congress to pick this up again. And there's a lot of, I don't want to say easy fixes, but relatively quick ones. Now, what's going on at the border at the moment is Donald Trump had a series of policies which included Title 42 as a COVID method that allowed the federal government to basically kick people across the border back to Mexico. The problem with that is because it was based on health as opposed to status, or legalities, they could just turn around and come right back in. So we got this laundry machine churn at the border for the last 3 years. And when Biden came in, there were a lot of folks within the Democratic coalition who were relatively pro-immigration, primarily because Donald Trump was anti-immigration. And so when Biden inherited this problem, he ended up using most of the same tools that the Trump administration used. But because he was perceived as being less anti-migration, people just kept jumping into that laundry. The Biden administration has done away with Title 42 and put in a two-pronged program. Now, this has only been in place for like 2 days, so God knows if it's going to work. But step one is doing something we have not done since the 70s and sending staff down to Central America to run processing centers. The idea is you register with American Immigration before you even leave your country. And so if you've got a claim of prosecution or asylum, they can resolve that hopefully fairly quickly and have larger, more robust, more reliable means for legal migration. However, if you show up at the border without having first gone to the processing center, they've changed the definition of asylum so that 99% of people crossing the border automatically do not qualify. So, for example, if you start in Honduras and you pass through Guatemala and Mexico on your way there, you are automatically disqualified, because if you are going for asylum, that means you're scared to live at home and you crossed any international border on your way, clearly you're lying. And so they don't even have to look at your case. And if you do that, you cannot even apply at a processing center for the next 5 years. The goal is to end the laundry machine. Now, will this work? God knows. And there are other clauses in this that various folks across the country don't have problems with. So the legal challenges have already begun. But for the first time since Reagan, in any world where the United States is no longer banning war and is no longer regulating commerce in the way that we did during the Cold War and the post-Cold War period, the Russians were always going to go out and try to resecure what they see as the gateway invasion access corridors, places like the Polish Plain, the Bessarabian Gap, the Baltic Sea. They were always going to try to do this. What has changed is that the Russians are literally dying out. And the post-Cold War generation that was born through the 1990s was so small that the Russians were losing the capacity to field a regular army. So if they didn't do it now, they would lose the possibility, and they would be then unanchored in this kind of great open flat zone in the middle of Eurasia, and the next time there's a war, they couldn't stop it. So they're hoping to forward position what they've got left in these gaps. And Ukraine, unfortunately, is between them and two of the most important gaps. So it's not just that they're going for Ukraine, they're going for Moldova, they're going for parts of Romania and Poland and all of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. It's just a question of timing. But Ukraine is the flavor of the month. I kind of see this war as the last conflict of the Cold War, because as long as the Russians existed, and if their security was going to drive their decision-making. So it's kind of like how the Civil War was the final war of the American Revolution. We're kind of at the end of this section of history now. If you are in Putin's inner circle, you don't dare give him bad news because he will kill you. So there were a lot of assumptions that were made in the Kremlin that just have turned out to not be true. Now, in all due defense to Putin and the Kremlin, everyone in the West was thinking the same way. We never thought that the Europeans would pull together in the way that they did. We never thought that we would get any sort of meaningful international sanctions that included countries like Japan and Korea. We thought that the Ukrainians would crumble. We thought that the war would be over in a month. Everyone has gotten it wrong. But from my point of view, the single biggest flaw is the complete collapse institutionally of the Russian military. They are making mistakes that were worse than what the Iraqis did in 1992 or what they themselves did during the Chechen wars. Just the inability of them to launch any sort of meaningful multi-domain operation in what we thought of as the second most advanced military in the world is just blows your mind and forces the Russians now to do siege mentality tactics where they just obliterate civilian infrastructure, because now that's the only way they can win the war. No one, even in Europe, anticipated this level of support. And everyone is taking any weapon system that they can that doesn't require a static footprint, so no jets, because that requires an airport or an airfield. But anything that can be carried or moved by truck that is not nailed down is being shipped in. And the reason originally was they wanted to give the Ukrainians a fighting chance. But I think it was the convoy that was north of Kiev, the 40-mile long one, that terrified Western leaders. Because we had this 40-mile convoy with thousands of vehicles that stalled out in a day because of lack of fuel, just horrible logistics. And then 2 days later, they ran out of food. And so all the soldiers had to get out and walk back to Belarus, just leaving their vehicles behind. Well, from a certain point of view, that's yay, the Russians are incompetent. But until you realize that if there ever was a direct conflict between Western and especially American forces and Russian forces on the battlefield, the Russians would be obliterated. That's a bad thing, because it means that if Russia pushes through and captures all of Ukraine and then moves to its next stages, which are those gaps in Romania and Poland, for example, there will be a direct fight, and the Russians would be obliterated, and they would then face a simple choice.